What they hide in the Appalachian Mountains is more terrifying than you think. Say it again, because you need to hear it twice before you understand what it means. What they hide in the Appalachian Mountains is more terrifying than you think. Not terrifying in the way our horror movie is terrifying, where you can close your eyes and remind yourself it is not real. Terrifying in the way that silence is terrifying when you hear deep in the woods and you suddenly realize you can't hear a single animal, not a bird, not a cricket, not a single living thing moving in the trees around you. Terrifying in the way that a door that was closed is now open, and you absolutely know, that you didn't open it. This is the story of what was found in the hollow places of those mountains. This is the story of the Harlan family, and this story is true. There is a particular kind of darkness that exists in the Appalachian Mountains that people who have never been there cannot fully understand. It is not the darkness of our city at night, where light pollution tones the sky a dull orange and you can always see the glow of something human on the horizon. It is not even the darkness of the countryside, where farms sit silent under a wide open sky and the stars are bright enough to see your shadow. The darkness of the Appalachians is something older than that, something more patient. It lives between the trees, which grow so dense and so tall that even in the middle of a sunny afternoon, certain hollows and ravines never see direct sunlight. It pools in the creek beds, where the water ooze black over stones slick with moss. It settles into the abandoned structures scattered throughout those hills, the falling cabins and collapsed barns and crumbling stone foundations of homesteads that have not been inhabited for so long that no one alive remembers who built them or why they left. In certain places, deep in certain valleys that don't appear on modern maps, it gathers into something that feels almost intentional, almost aware. Travelers who have passed through those regions at night describe a feeling that is difficult to put into words. A sense of pressure, they say, a sense that the air itself is watching. Some of them have reported pulling their cars over on narrow mountain roads because they felt, with complete terrifying certainty, that they were not alone, that something was there in the tree line, standing absolutely still, looking directly at them. None of them could ever explain why they felt that way. They just knew. The mountains have always kept their secrets well. For centuries, communities developed in those remote hollows that were almost completely cut off from the outside world. No roads reached them, no newspapers arrived, no outsiders came through and no insiders went out. These communities existed in a kind of suspended time, developing their own customs, their own rules, their own understanding of what was acceptable and what was not. Most of them are gone now. Most of them collapsed or dispersed as roads finally connected the mountains till the modern world. Younger generations left for cities where life was easier and opportunity was possible. What remained behind were the structures and the stories and, in some cases, the people who had no interest in leaving and no desire to be found. The Harlan family was one of those cases. The researcher who first found documentation of the Harlan family was a woman named Celeste Morgan, a folklorist from a small university in Western Virginia, who spent 15 years collecting oral histories from Appalachian communities. She had heard dozens of stories by the time she came across the name Harlan, spoken in a low voice by an elderly woman in a county that Morgan had promised not to identify in her publications. The elderly woman, whom Morgan referred to in her notes only as May, had grown up about 12 miles from the hollow where the Harlans lived. She had never been there herself. She had never wanted to go, but she had heard things, she said, things that people who had accidentally stumbled into that area had come back and reported. And some people, she added, had not come back at all. Morgan's field notes from that conversation run to 37 pages. What follows is drawn from those notes, from subsequent research Morgan conducted over the following 3 years, and from the account of the only known outsider who spent significant time with what remained of the Harlan family and survived to describe the experience in detail. That person's name was Daniel Marsh. He was a wildlife biologist conducting a survey of black bear populations in remote Appalachian habitats in the autumn of several years ago. He had been hiking alone for 4 days when he found the structure. He did not know it was inhabited. He had no reason to expect anyone would be living there. What happened to him over the following 6 days is the subject of what you are about to hear. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. Daniel Marsh had been hiking through dense second-growth forest for most of the day, following the course of a small creek that his topographic map suggested would eventually lead him to a ridge where he could get his bearings. The sky had been overcast since morning, and the light filtering down through the canopy was graying flesh, the kind of light that flattens distances and makes it difficult to judge how far you have traveled or how much time has passed. He smelled it before he saw anything, a complex, layered smell that he would later struggle to describe, something organic and deeply wrong, the way a wound smells when it has been closed too long without air, but beneath that something is smokier, something older, something that made him think involuntarily of very old wood, a very damp earth, and something else he couldn't name, something that had no reference point in his experience. He stopped walking. The creek continued to murmur beside him. A light wind moved through the upper canopy. Otherwise there was silence, the kind of silence that he had learned, over years of fieldwork in remote locations, to pay attention to. Animals go quiet for reasons. When an entire section of forest goes quiet, there is always a reason. He stood still for a long time. He told investigators afterward that he wasn't sure why he didn't simply turn around and walk back the way he had come. Something kept him there. Something about the quality of the silence, or about the smell, or about a feeling he had that he was on the edge of something that needed to be understood. He was a scientist. He was trained to investigate. He kept walking. The structure appeared around a bend in the creek, set back about 40 feet from the water in a small clearing that seemed almost deliberately carved out of the surrounding trees. Each was low and sprawling and old, built from rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age till the color of charcoal. Each had clearly been added to over many generations, new sections attached to old ones at odd angles, the roof lines uneven and the windows, where there were windows, small and deep, sitting dark. There was smoke coming from a stone chimney at one end, a thin, steady column of it, rising straight up into the still air. Marsh stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the structure for a long time. He had encountered inhabited cabins in remote areas before. It wasn't unusual. Hunters used them, sometimes for weeks at a time. Old mountain families maintained hunting camps that had been in their possession for generations. He had no reason at this point to feel afraid, but he felt afraid. He told investigators later that it was the windows that did it. They were dark, all of them, either way the windows are dark when light is burning inside, but they were not empty. He had the absolute, unshakable conviction that something was positioned behind each one of those dark rectangles of glass, watching him with total patience, in total stillness, the way a predator watches prey before the moment it decides to act. He told himself he was being irrational. He stepped out of the tree line and walked toward the structure. He had taken perhaps 10 steps when the door opened. The figure that appeared in the doorway was large. That was the first thing Marsh registered. It took him a moment to fully process what he was seeing because his brain kept trying to normalize it, kept trying to fit the shape in front of him into categories that he understood. The figure was adult, clearly adult, a man by hiding build, wearing clothing that was dark and shapeless, a coat or a cloak of some kind that reached almost till the ground. He was perhaps 6 feet tall, possibly taller. His hands, which hung at his sides, were large and the fingers were oddly proportioned, longer than they should have been, the joints prominent in a way that caught the flesh gray light. But each was the face that stopped Marsh where he stood. He would describe each man chimizi the weeks that followed. Each description would be slightly different, not because he was inconsistent but because the face resisted easy description, resisted the kind of clean language that would make it easy to understand. The features were human, all of them, eyes, a nose and mouth, and jaw, all present and correctly positioned. But something in their arrangement was wrong in a way that was difficult to specify. The symmetry was off, he would say. The proportions were not quite right. The eyes were too close together or perhaps too far apart. Or perhaps it was the depth at which they sat in the face, recessed further than normal so that they lived in shadow even in open air. The jaw was heavier than it should have been. The brow was pronounced. The mouth was moving, Marsh realized. The figure in the doorway was speaking, but the sound was not reaching him, or if it was reaching him, he was not processing each's language. It took him several seconds to understand that this was because the figure was not speaking loudly enough to be heard at this distance, was murmuring something yellow, continuous tone that seemed addressed to the clearing itself rather than to him. Then the murmuring stopped, and the eyes found him. Even at that distance, even in that flat gray light, with those eyes such deep in that wrong face, He felt the moment of contact like a physical thing, like a hand placed on his chest, like a change in pressure. The figure stood in the doorway and looked at him and did not move. What happened next would be the subject of significant debate among the investigators who later spoke with Marsh and among the few academics who eventually heard his account. Marsh himself was consistent in his description but acknowledged freely that what he described made no logical sense. He felt compelled to approach. Not in the way that you might feel compelled to approach something interesting or something that needed investigation. This was different. He described each as a feeling of inevitability, as though approaching the structure was something that had already been decided, as though his body was simply carrying out instructions that had been issued before he was aware of receiving them. He was not frightened, he said, which itself frightened him, because he knew that he should be frightened. He could observe from a rational distance that the situation warranted fear, but the fear was somehow not accessible to him. He walked till the door. The figure stepped back to let him enter. Inside, the smell was much stronger. The interior of the structure was a single large room that had clearly once been several smaller rooms, the walls between them partially removed so that the space had a cave-like quality, low ceilinged and irregular in shape. There was a fire burning in the stone fireplace at the far end, and it was the only source of light. And that light was orange and unsteady, and it threw shadows that moved in ways that seemed slightly misaligned with the movements that were causing them. There were two other figures in the room. One was seated in a large wooden chair near the fire, almost motionless, facing away from the door. All Marsh could see from his position was the back of a head and shoulders. Even that partial view was enough to make something in his mind recoil slightly before his rational self suppressed the reaction. The shape of the skull was not quite right. The line of the spine beneath the clothing was not quite right. Everything was just slightly off in a way that added up to something deeply wrong. The third figure was standing near the far wall, almost completely in shadow. Marsh could not tell whether each was male or female. He could not make out the features clearly. He could only see that each was shorter than the one who had let him in, and that each was very askew, and that whatever was wrong with the proportions of the first figure seemed more pronounced in this one, more fully expressed, as though whatever was being expressed in these people increased in intensity rather than diminishing. The one who had let him in gestured at a rough wooden chair near the fire. Marsh sat down. He sat down, he told investigators, because it seemed like the thing to do. Because his body continued to behave as though instructions had been issued that he was not aware of. Because the thought of refusing did not feel like a thought he was capable of completing. He sat near the fire and the heat was intense and the smell was overwhelming and the figure in the large wooden chair finally turned to look at him. What Marsh saw in the face of the seated figure was something that he spent a long time trying to describe and never fully managed. He would say only that whatever he had seen in the face of the one at the door was amplified in this one, refined to an intensity that made looking at it difficult. Not difficult in the way that looking at something ugly is difficult, he was careful to specify, but difficult in the way that looking at something that fundamentally challenges your understanding of what is here is difficult. As though the face were evidence of something that should not be possible, as though looking at it directly required you to accept that possibility. He accepted it. He had no choice. The figure in the chair was old. That much he could say with certainty. Very old, in a way that reduced the body to something minimal, something that had given up everything that was not essential. The hands in the lap were almost architectural in their angularity. The face was a landscape of lines that mapped a history he could not read, but the eyes were clear, entirely, disturbingly clear, and they regarded him with an intelligence that he found more frightening than anything else in that room, including the shadows that moved wrong and the smell that had no reference point, and the other figures standing at the edges of his awareness. Those eyes knew things. That was what he felt. Those eyes had been in that hollow for a very long time, and they had accumulated an understanding of something. He didn't know what, that most human eyes never arrived at. They looked at him and they were not surprised by him, as though they had been expecting him for a long time. He spent the night. He told investigators that this decision was not made consciously. Evening came, the light outside the small windows fading from gray to dark in what seemed like a matter of minutes. The idea of getting up and leaving and navigating those woods at night simply did not present itself as an available option. He sat by the fire and the three members of the Harlan family moved around and made their slow, heavy way, He watched them and they watched him. Almost nothing was said because whatever language or dialect they spoke was not fully intelligible to him. But there were sounds. There were sounds that came from outside as the night deepened, and those sounds were the thing that Marsh returned to again and again in his accounts, the thing that seemed to disturb him most deeply when everything else had faded somewhat with chimney processing. They began as something simple, a creak, the way wood creaks when weight is applied to each, as though something large were moving through the trees surrounding the clearing, but rhythmic. Slow and rhythmic, with pauses between the creaks that were exactly, perfectly equally length, as though whatever was out there was moving at a precise, deliberate pace. He had been moving at that pace for a very long time. He intended to continue moving at that pace indefinitely. Then there was something underneath the creaking, a lower sound. Not kitsch a voice and not kitsch the sound the wind makes when it passes through narrow spaces, but something between the two, something that had almost the quality of intention without actually being language, a sound that seemed to mean something without conveying anything that could be understood. Marsh looked at the three figures. None of them reacted to the sounds. None of them looked toward the windows or toward the door. They continued their slow movements, their slow stillness, as though the sounds outside were simply part of the environment, no more remarkable than the noise of the fire or the settling of the old structure around them, as though the sounds had always been there, as though the sounds would always be there. He slept, eventually, in the chair by the fire. He did not intend to sleep. He did not think he was capable of sleep in the room with those sounds outside and those three figures moving at the edges of his vision. But sleep came for him anyway, the way sleep comes when exhaustion overrides intention. Each was not a peaceful sleep. He dreamed that the clearing outside the structure was full of people, not the three figures inside but others, standing at the edge of the trees in the dark, facing the structure. They were all very astute. They were all facing the structure. In the dream he understood, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes in dreams, that these people had been standing there for a very long time, that they had been standing there before the structure existed, that they would be standing there after it fell, that they were waiting for something, that the thing they were waiting for was aware of them. He woke to a sound directly outside the door, not the rhythmic creaking from the trees. Something else, something close, a slow, heavy sound, like breathing, but larger than human breathing, deeper and slower and coming from something that needed more air than a human body needed. A sound that continued for several seconds. He then stopped. In the silence that followed, he heard, from just beyond the door, a register that was just at the edge of what human hearing could detect, something that might have been whispering, something that might have been his name. The oldest of the three Harlan figures was watching him from across the room with those clear, knowing eyes, and there was something in that gaze that might have been recognition, as though this tour were expected, as though this tour were part of something that had been set in motion long before he arrived. He stayed for 6 days. He told investigators that he lost track of time in a way that he had never experienced before, that hours seemed to collapse into each other, that he would look up and find that light that had been morning was now evening, and he had no account of the time between. He ate what the Harlans ate, which was plain and minimal, and prepared in ways he didn't examine too closely. He slept in the chair because lying on the floor felt wrong to him in a way he couldn't explain, as though being closer to the ground in that place were inadvisable. He tried to leave on the 3rd day. He stood up from the chair, he walked till the door, he put his hand on the latch. The door did not open, not because it was locked. He could feel that it was not locked. But when he applied pressure, the door simply did not move, as though there outside were pressing against it from the other side with exactly enough force to hold it shut. He stood there with his hand on the latch for what might have been 5 minutes, it might have been longer, and then the oldest figure made a sound that wasn't a word but communicated clearly enough. He went back to the chair. He did not try the door again. At night the sounds from outside continued. Always the same sequence, the slow rhythmic creaking first, from the tree line, then the lower sounds underneath, then eventually, in the deepest part of the night, the breathing outside the door. He began to notice that the breathing was getting closer over successive nights, or not the breathing itself, but the door behind which the breathing occurred. As though whatever was making the sound was not moving toward the door but the door itself was moving, slowly, night by night, toward what was on the other side. He did not tell investigators what he thought was on the other side. He said only that he had formed a belief about it over those 6 nights that he was not willing to share because sharing it would require him to have it written though somewhere, to make it permanent. He was not willing to do that. So many things, he said, are safe and unspoken. On the 6th night, the door opened, not the front door, a door at the back of the structure that he had not previously noticed. A low door such into a section he had thought was solid, concealed by the darkness and the accumulation of objects leaned against the wall. He saw each because the second of the 3 figures, the shorter one who had spent 6 days almost entirely in shadow, moved to each and lifted the latch. Each swung inward without resistance. The air that came in through the open door was cold, much colder than the night air outside should have been in that season. A deep, settled cold, the kind that belongs to places where sunlight never reaches, where the temperature is determined not by season but by depth. The figure stood in the doorway and looked at Marsh. In the firelight, for the first time, he could see its face more clearly than he had managed in 6 days of proximity, and he understood in that moment why he had been unable to see it clearly before. Not because the light had been insufficient, because some part of him had been actively resisting the information. He could not describe what he saw. He tried. In the days that followed, the words he reached for kept sliding away from the thing they were meant to describe. He said only that the face was both human and not human, that each existed in a space between categories that his mind did not have a framework for, in that looking at it directly for the first time produced a feeling in him that he had never experienced before. He hoped never to experience again, a kind of vertigo of understanding, as though a door in his mind had been opened onto a space he had not known was there. The figure stepped back through the low door. A Marsh followed. He could not account for what happened outside. He found himself in the clearing at the back of the structure, the cold air pressing against him, the tree line visible in the dim light of a partial moon. The figure was in front of him, moving toward the trees with a slow, heavy stride that covered more ground than each should have given it space. He followed each into the trees and among the trees and through a darkness that was so complete he could not see his own hands in front of him, and yet somehow he could see enough to keep following, as though his body were navigating by something other than sight. And then they were in a place that he could only describe as a hollow within a hollow, a place that the forest had arranged itself around a ring, leaving a circular space up until the sky. In the center of that space was something he would not describe, something that the figure stood beside with its head bowed and its long hands at its sides. He stood at the edge of the ring. He could not move forward and he did not want to. The moonlight in the clearing was different from the moonlight in the forest. Brighter and somehow thicker, as though the air itself in that space had a different quality, a different density. And the sound that had been outside the door for 6 nights, the breathing, was editor. But each was not coming from any specific direction. Each was coming from everywhere, from the trees in the ground, in the air itself. He stood there for a time he could not measure. And then the figure turned and walked back toward the structure and he followed each back through the dark trees and through the low door and back to the chair by the fire. In the morning when the gray light came through the small windows the front door opened. When he pushed each, just opened as naturally as any door he had ever used. He walked out into the cold morning, he entered the trees, and he kept walking until he reached a road. He flagged down the first vehicle he saw. He sat in the back seat and he could not speak for approximately 2 hours. The people who found him called for medical assistance. He was not physically injured, but there was something in his eyes that the people who found him mentioned repeatedly when they were later interviewed, a quality that they struggled to describe. As though some knowledge had been added there that changed the way the eyes processed what they were looking at, as though he had seen something that could not be unseen. Celeste Morgan drove to the county 6 months after speaking with me and 3 months after learning about Danielle Marsh through a contact in the university system who had heard his account secondhand. She spent 4 days interviewing people in the area, people who would speak to her, which were not men. She gathered fragments of stories that went back many generations. Stories about the hollow, about the family each, about things that people had heard or seen or have seen at the edges of their awareness over the course of their lifetimes. Stories that converge on certain details with the consistency that, in Morgan's experience, indicated something rooted in collective experience rather than individual imagination. The sounds in the night were mentioned in almost every account. The slow rhythmic creaking from the trees, the lower sound underneath, the breathing at the threshold. These were described by people who had grown up 12 miles away and had never, by their own account, been anywhere near the hollow, described in the kind of detail that comes from direct experience. Morgay did not understand how this was possible. She wrote her notes that she was going to have to sit with this inconsistency for a while before she could address it. There was also a recurring detail in the older accounts, the ones that many others of her generation had heard from their own parents and grandparents, a detail about what the hollow had been before the Harlan family, about what had been there before any family, before any structure, before any human presence in those hills. She was not able to fully reconstruct this part of the history from the fragments she collected. The pieces didn't fit together into anything she could describe with confidence, but there was a direction they pointed toward, a shape they implied, and each was not a shape she found comfortable to contemplate. She returned to her university and wrote up her findings and then put the file in a drawer and did not return to it for 2 years. When she finally did return to it, she drove back to the county, asked around, and learned that no one had been to the hollow recently. No one from outside, no deliveries, no welfare checks, no accidental encounters, nothing. She asked May, who was still alive, still sharp, still willing to speak in that low, careful voice about things that she had heard and not seen. May said that the family had been in that hollow for a very long time, longer than anyone could account for, longer than the oldest stories reached. She said that there was a reason one went there, not a reason that had been spoken aloud and decided upon, the way communities decide to avoid places they have determined to be dangerous, just a knowledge, a shared, unspoken, inherited knowledge that had passed from generation to generation as reliably as any other kind of inheritance. Some places, May said, have a nature, like a person has a nature. The nature of that hollow was not something that anyone who wanted to go on live a certain kind of life had any business coming into contact with. She paused for a long time after saying this. Then she said, the family is part of the nature now. They were always part of it. Maybe they always will be. Morgay wrote this down and looked at it for a long time. There is a creek in the Appalachians, a county that will not be named, that rolls black over mossy stones through a forest of old trees. If you follow it long enough in the right direction, you will come to a hollow where the air has a different quality, a different pressure, where the light comes down through the canopy at an angle that seems slightly wrong for the time of day, where the silence is, the kind of silence that has intention. In that hollow there is a structure, or there was. Whether it is still standing, one who would speak on record can say with certainty. Whether it is inhabited, no one who would speak on record is willing to confirm or deny. But there are the people in that county who will not go near that creek after dark, who will not let their children go near it even in daylight, who have never explained to their children exactly why, because so many things are transmitted more reliably through tone, instinct than through words. And at night, in certain weather, when the conditions are right, people who live in that general area have reported hearing things from the direction of the mountains that they cannot explain. A slow rhythmic sound from the tree line, like weight applied to old wood, a pattern that is too regular to be random. A lower sound underneath, almost at the threshold of hearing, that is almost but not kitsch the quality of language. And sometimes, rarely, in the deepest part of the night, when the sound has been building long enough, something else, something that might be breathing, something that might be very close. They do not go to the window when they hear this. They have learned not to go to the window. Some of them pull the covers up, and some of them turn on a light, and some of them lie perfectly still and wait for morning with a patience that they have also inherited without being told how. And in the morning it is always gone. The sounds are always gone, and the light is ordinary, and the birds are singing, and it is possible, in the morning, to believe that nothing is wrong. This is what they have learned to do. This is what has been learned over generations of proximity to something that does not have a name. You keep your lights on. You do not go to the window. You wait for morning. And in the morning you go on with your life, and you do not speak about what you heard in the night, because speaking about it feels like an invitation, and there are the things in those mountains that you do not want to invite. Daniel Marsh resigned his position at the university 14 months after his return. He moved to a city on the coast, as far from the mountains as he could get while remaining in the entry. People who knew him before and after describe a change in him that is consistent across accounts. Not a dramatic change, a quiet one, a settling of something behind the eyes, a quality of attention that was different from before, mighty careful, mighty patient, as though he were always listening for something. He gave one interview to a journalist he trusted 3 years after the event. He spoke for 2 hours and then asked that the recording be destroyed. The journalist honored the request. What the journalist later described of that conversation, carefully without specific detail, was that Marsh had seemed less concerned with what had happened to him that Hollow than with what each implied, about the nature of the mountains, about the nature of the family Edom, about certain things that exist in isolated places for very long periods of chimi develop directions that have no analogy in ordinary human experience. He said one thing that the journalist remembered precisely, repeated. He said, they were not wrong, exactly. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Whatever they were, whatever they had become, each was not wrong in the way that wrong things usually are. Each was just very, very far from anything I had a framework for. I think about what each would take, what each would cost, what each would require of a person, to be that far from any framework, to have been in a place long enough, the dark in the silence, learning from whatever was in that hollow with them, to arrive at whatever they had arrived at. He paused, the journalist said. Then he said, I don't want to understand it. I have worked very hard not to understand it. So many things you are better off in not understanding all the way. The journalist asked him if he ever thought about going back. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, something that Hollow knows my name. I heard it on the 6th night. I heard it outside the door. So no, I don't think about going back. I think about staying as far away as I can. I think about whether staying far away is enough. Mostly I just try to sleep. He smiled when he said that last part. The journalist noted that the smile did not reach his eyes. The Appalachian Mountains are old, older than most mountains on Earth. They have been worn down by chimiform peaks that were once as high as the Himalayas to the gentle ridges and hollows they are now. They have been worn down, but they are not empty. Whatever was in them when they were new is still in them now, patient in the way that old things are patient and hurried, settled into the bedrock of those hills with the permanence of this stone itself. There are places in those mountains that have never been mapped, not because they are inaccessible, though some of them are, but because the people who have gone into them to map them have come back with their instruments giving readings that don't make sense, with photographs that show things that were there when the photographs were taken, with a feeling that they were being moved through the landscape direction that was not the direction they had intended to go. Some of them have come back changed, in the way that Danielle Marsh was changed, with something added behind the eyes that was not there before. Some of them have not come back at all. This is what the mountains keep. This is what they hold in those dark hollows between the old trees, in those places where the light is wrong and the air has pressure and the silence has intention. This is what they hide. Each is more terrifying than you think, not because each is violent, not because each reaches out and takes, but because each is patient, because each has always been there, each will always be there, each knows your name even though you have never been near each, even though you have never set your foot in those hills, even though you are sitting somewhere safe right now, far from any mountain, far from any dark, each knows. It is the most terrifying thing of all, not the sounds in the night, not the face behind the glass, not the breathing at the threshold, the knowing, the absolute, ancient, certain knowing, that you are it, that you are listening, that you are always going to be listening till this. Sleep well tonight. If you hear something outside your window, something slow and rhythmic that showed you to be there, something low underneath each, something that has almost the quality of language, don't go to the window, just wait for morning, just wait. Sonnet 46.